Greetings, this is GBA 383, Business and Society, and we are looking at Chapter 8 right now in the textbook. It's our last chapter, Ethics and the Employee. And this chapter is about the employer-employee relationship and ethical considerations in terms of how the employee is treated and how the employee needs to behave. So this is a fun chapter, one of my favorites. There are 4 learning objectives for this chapter. Number 1, to describe the rational model of the business organization in the context of structure and the obligations between employer and employee. So what should structure look like? What are the expectations in terms of our reporting responsibilities and the command and control of the organization? Then we're going to look at the political model of the organization in terms of powers and rights and what is considered to be just or fair. We'll talk about the informal power relationships in the organization, particularly with respect to how we interact with each other informally, and think about that from an ethical perspective. And then lastly, what are the ethical characteristics of a caring organization? And we should wrap this up pretty nicely. So the basic stuff that we're going to dive into is understanding what is the traditional model of the organization, as well as the more contemporary ideas, the political model, the political notions of it, as well as the network of personal relationships, which is kind of related to that ethics of care model that we've been talking about all semester. So that traditional view tends to think of the old-fashioned command and control. What is my locus of control in the organization? What's my span of control in terms of the people that report to me? All those sorts of things. It's an older model, and while it served us well in a bureaucratic time when things were very organized, at the end of the day, it doesn't fly anymore, because the way that we have to structure our organizations and the adaptability and flexibility we need to be able to respond to marketplaces really quickly, that old rational structure doesn't serve us anymore. A way to think about it politically is getting at the politics of relationships, both formally and informally in the organization, and who has the power, where does the power lie. Even somebody that doesn't have position power may have enormous political power in an organization or influence. But really, at the end of the day, as we talked about when it comes to marketing and many other things, the most important foundational thing that we do in the way that our organization is set up has to do with the relationships and the stakeholders that we represent. So the stakeholders are all those that affect or are affected by the organization. And with those stakeholders, they're about what kind of relationship we want to have. Now, this goes back to the Freeman arguments early on in the chapter, early on in the class, where we were talking about the contrast to the Friedman point of view, which was we only care about shareholders and shareholder market value. Really, Freeman's work on stakeholders is much more about how do we build good personal relationships? How do we dive in from there? And that's where our attention really needs to be in the 21st century when it comes to the way organizations need to function to be successful and have good reputations in the world. So when we think about the rational model of a business organization, there are a whole host of rules of engagement, basically what the structure is supposed to look like, how people are supposed to relate to each other, both on the horizontal and the vertical. So as you see, there's the hierarchy, the top managers at the top, middle management has its role, and then the operating layer. And the top manager's job, of course, is to set the strategic direction of the organization, to make the bigger decisions, and to direct people. Middle management's job is to take what the top management initiatives are, to translate that, to guide and make sure that the operational level of the organization is doing what it needs to do. And then the operational level is all the rest of us that are scurrying around like little ants doing the work that we are being told to do based on, our job descriptions and what have you. So, and we all play a role. While yes, the top management team is at the highest level of the hierarchy, of course, and they get paid the most, of course. Um, Everybody has a role to play in managing the organization. You can't have a top management team without having operating people to do the work. And the operating people could do the work, but without the guidance of the top management team and middle managers, it would be very challenging. And so it used to be in the olden days, back in the 70s and the 60s and the 50s, in the 20th century, where we saw a lot of middle managers and organizations were very tall and with a lot of middle managers sort of managing all sorts of stuff going on in the company. And as we knew that we needed to be leaner and more effective in our decision making, we cut out a lot of middle management. A lot of those layers in the middle got disappeared. And we started expanding what we call the span of control of each of the remaining middle managers. And so instead of having a handful of direct reports, middle managers now may have twice that. Because we have fewer middle managers, we still have to get the work of the organization done. Then I have more people, more responsibilities thrust upon me as part of middle management. But the ethical obligations we have is, what obligation does the employee have to the organization and the employer? The obligation to follow the directions of the organization. Although some would argue that there's a loyalty to the organization. I don't know if loyalty is the right word. I'm really uncomfortable with loyalty because often when we think about loyalty, it's embedded in this notion of blind loyalty. To me, loyalty is earned. So I would rather think about it as my willingness to do the work of the organization because there's a mutually beneficial relationship going on. But by and large, they're talking about this notion of being loyal to the organization's goals, not doing anything to interfere with that directly, certainly not working with competitors to undermine the organization. So from that perspective, I'm okay with that word loyalty. But the goal is that the organization sets the tone and the behaviors and the scope of things that they want people to do. And as part of that employment relationship, the employees are then obligated to do that in exchange for getting paid good wages, having a good work, and having good working conditions, which means not a toxic environment, having clear expectations, the resources I need to be able to do my job, and good wages, and to know that I'm going to be safe and not hurt on the job because the company is taking shortcuts, right? And we've talked a lot about, externalities of pollution and things like that. These things affect the employees as well. It's not just the local community that's affected by pollution or challenging problems in the way that the organization manages itself. Everybody is affected by it, including employees. And when we don't have good safety protocols on board for our employees, we are not treating them fairly or kindly with respect to how they should be treated as an employee. Because if we treat them like they're a commodity, meaning that they're a dime a dozen, I lose one, I get another one, we start to lose our ability to attract good quality workers. And all we're going to do is attract people who can do the bare minimum because they can't get a job anywhere else. So we're not going to attract high quality people if we treat our people as commodities. What are the employer's obligation, the employee's obligation to the organization? Number one is we are supposed to make sure that we are doing the work of the organization no matter what. And that is told to us by its agents, middle managers and senior managers, about what we need to do, how we need to do it, by what time we need to do it, etc. The legal obligation of the employee to the employer is called the law of agency, which means that I am the agent, and you are the principal, if you're the owner or uh, the organization itself is called the principal, and we have an agency relationship. The expectation is that there are certain legal duties embedded in that, treating people fairly, paying them for their expected work, in it with the appropriate wage that was agreed upon. That we're not going to undermine them, we're not going to cheat them out of wages and things like that. Of course, there's always conflicts, always. And if you're being told to do something that's inappropriate, that's a problem, and that can create a conflict. And also, if the organization wants you to do something in a certain way, um, that is not necessarily the way the employee wants to do it, and vice versa. Those things have to be in alignment. So that's where those conflicts of interest will come into play, when there is a disconnect between the interests of the employee and the interests of the employer. What typically might we see? Well, conflicts of interest, as I said, are typically subjective and objective. The objective conflicts of interest are based on financial issues. The subjective ones are typically based on relationship or emotional related issues. Both of those are incredibly valid and incredibly important. And one is not more important than the other. Both are important, because you can make money all day long, but if it's a toxic work environment, you're not going to want to continue to stay there just because the money is good. And vice versa, if it's a great environment but you're not getting paid well, that's also not a great place you want to be. So we need to have a good environment, and we need to be paid fairly, from a financial perspectives. Um, there are potential conflicts of interest when the employee has an inference that is influenced by their action, but has not been assigned the particular task in which the influence could manifest. So what this basically means from my perspective is that I am capable of doing things, but I haven't been given the responsibility to do it. And so I'm going to have a conflict of interest when I know I could do something, but I'm not allowed to do something. Conflict of interest also happen when the task could manifest the interest has been assigned to the employee with that interest. So, I have an interest in it, maybe somebody can do it better. So there's all sorts of conflicts that can occur there. And the goal is, of course, that we want to minimize those conflicts of interest. We don't want people doing things that are against their conscience. We also don't want people to be doing things that is out of their comfort zone and they're not capable of doing without proper training and resources and those sorts of things. Um, what sort of situations create conflicts of interest? Bribes, extortion, when we're asking people to do something that is outside of the scope of their job, they're not comfortable with it. They're being asked to bribe or to force somebody to do something. I got forced oftentimes by one of my bosses to accept gifts from vendors that were intimate gifts, not just like, oh, I'm going to give you this rubber ball to sit at your desk, or here's some tape, or here's some, post-it notes. But I would be getting gifts like pearl earrings and gold necklaces because they wanted my business. And that made me really uncomfortable because I didn't want to give them business just because they were giving me necklaces and earrings and things like that. So that was like they were trying to bribe me, and that made me really uncomfortable. And my organization wanted me to engender that. They wanted me to cultivate that, which I thought was really uncomfortable. We want to be careful about things like theft and stuff like that, because theft also can get us into an enormous amount of trouble. And when we're talking about theft, it's not just about material, but it's also about proprietary ideas, um, like the recipe for Coca-Cola, those sorts of things, trade secrets, and it's also about theft of time. When you spend enormous amounts of time surfing the web and playing on your computer and chatting with your colleagues above and beyond the normal chit chat one would expect, a lot of organizations would argue that this is a theft of time from them, and they could fire you for that. And I've certainly seen that happen when people spend too much time surfing the internet and not really doing their job. Um, there are also issues with non-compete agreements, so that if you leave the company for a period of time, you will not be able to go and work for another employer somewhere. Now, the issue with the non-compete agreements are many organizations have them, but they're really not good and valid tools. For example, Jimmy John's used to have a non-compete agreement for their entry-level employees that they would have to sign and say you won't work for another fast food company in the area for a certain period of time after you leave working for Jimmy John's. Now, you're talking about entry-level workers. That's an undue burden on your entry-level workers because you're asking them to sign a non-compete agreement. There's nothing that they know proprietary about how to make a stinking sandwich other than you put mayonnaise and meat and lettuce and tomatoes on it, right? I mean, there's nothing more to it really than that. What is proprietary, of course, is where they source the resources, where they source the meat and the lettuce and the food and that kind of thing. But that's not anything that the employee has control over. So those non-compete agreements have been found to be illegal. And they're also, I think, unethical on many levels because we should not interfere with someone's ability to get work and to make a livelihood for themselves and to support themselves and their families. Other aspects of unethical behaviors and conflicts of interest have to do with insider trading. And with insider trading, employees know all sorts of secrets about what's going to happen to the company. They are anticipating things are going to happen. And so if they're stockholders and then they go in and they sell those stocks right before they know something bad is going to happen, then they have pre-knowledge on something, or they buy some stock knowing that something good is going to happen. That's considered insider trading, and you're going to go to jail for that if you're found out. If Martha Stewart can go to jail for it, anybody can go to jail for it. So very important to consider that. Insider trading is unfair because I have information that's not fair or just. I have inside information that gives me more leverage to make better financial decisions than the average investor, which is not okay. It's not good for economic utility because I've got that advantage, and that harms other people, and that's the other issue that we want to be careful about.